Alright, so hey everyone, today I want to take another look at Splitgate. I made a video on this a little over a year ago, and since then this game has recently been released on consoles and has some additional options for the dead zones as well as the acceleration, so that addresses some of the issues I brought up. But you can see that it's still using a square dead zone. Movement starts very slow, so it might not be too obvious. Previously, when I originally looked at this game, it was about a 25% square, but that's been reduced to 12% for the default. But being square, you still have these restricted diagonal regions, which are most obvious when looking straight up or down. And you can see you have to break out of these thresholds before diagonal movement begins. This shaded region represents the acceleration threshold, so you can see that it jumps up once you pass through that. This too is a little easier to see when looking straight up or down because of the rotation of the buildings. Movement, I didn't test the sprint threshold, so I'll try to link an updated graph in the description, but this uses a 20% square with expected restricted diagonal movement. And to look at this for aiming, we'll max out the dead zones, and I'll change the graph. So it's interesting, the maximum dead zone size you can select now is smaller than the previous default last time I looked at this. But since these restricted diagonal regions scale with dead zone size, you can see now that, like movement, we have more restricted diagonal movement. And this actually warps the acceleration threshold, so it's a little more squarish than it was before. And to look at the other extreme, and I'll change the graphs. You can see that it does let you go set a 0% dead zone, so any stick movement creates cursor movement. And with no axial dead zone present, you have access to full diagonal movement, so very subtle angles will be picked up and applied. And this brings us to the first request, and that's a change to circular dead zones. Circular dead zones would allow you to exit the dead zone consistently on every angle, but would also allow you full diagonal movement at any dead zone size. So if a player wanted to use a 20% dead zone, they could do so without impacting their diagonal movement at all. And of course that should apply to movement as well. It's not as important, but it would help make movement feel a slight bit smoother. The next request would be for options for aim assist. This has been updated since I last looked at it. When I last looked at it, the window is very tight, and once aim assist triggered, you would track them pretty firmly. Here it's much more traditional, so we have standard tracking. You can see that I'm not pushing or moving the right stick, but the character will turn slightly to try to face the target. And slowdown, where your sensitivity drops when passing over a target. This is much more obvious over here, where you can see that it snags on all these targets that it passes over. And lastly, bullet magnetism, either that or giant hitboxes. So you can see that the battle rifle has a pretty tight spread. But if your reticle's red, those all guarantee shots. Now, being able to disable this bullet magnetism might greatly affect weapon balance, um, but at least giving options for the tracking and the slowdown would be requested. Ideally, yeah, separate sliders, because some players like, say, slowdown, but they don't want tracking, or vice versa, and having separate options would allow players to do that, and sliders would allow players to finally customize just how much of each they want. And of course, players that don't want any aim assist would be able to access those with those options. The next request is for control over the acceleration curve. So Splitgate uses a quadratic curve. That's pretty standard. But some players might like different curves. Some players might want linear or something in between. And a quadratic is part of a simple power function. So giving players control over the degree, ranging from 1.0, a linear curve, to 3.0, a cubic curve with 0.1 increments, would give players a ton of control over that. The next thing is, let me disable acceleration so that doesn't affect anything. Whoops. You can see that I've maxed out both the horizontal and vertical sensitivities, and they're the same. But it seems like the horizontal sensitivity is faster than the vertical sensitivity. Now, because we have separate options, we could adjust this to try to make them even. Some players like having lower vertical sensitivities, but having these different, it just isn't intuitive. And on top of just being different, having differing axis sensitivities also skews your diagonal movement. So, for example, like the more the angle that your cursor moves in will be biased towards the more sensitive axis. So in this case, the horizontal axis. So all your angles will be more biased horizontally, so your movements will be kind of flatter. And using this kind of square portal wall as reference, if I started from here and tried to move at a 45-degree angle, you'd expect to move about here. It won't be perfect, but if I do it with this current sensitivities where they're both the same, you can see that it falls pretty dramatically short of that. And to do that again, it falls short of that. A lot of games set like the vertical sensitivity to about half, and I don't know if that's the exact ratio here, but you can see that if I do that again, once these are adjusted, that that's much more accurate to the stick movements. So the request would be to have these sliders weighted the same. So if you have them set the same, that you have equal horizontal and vertical sensitivity. It's just more intuitive that way. Lastly would be to increase the cap for the sensitivity. Like right now I don't have any acceleration, so this is the maximum turn rate you can get without acceleration. And if we add acceleration, let's just max that out, you can see that you can turn quite fast. But some players don't like acceleration. Many don't, because it automatically increases over time, so the player doesn't have direct control over that. And being able to disable that would allow players to aim more consistently. But without it, we currently have kind of a modest sensitivity cap. Increasing this to about 20 or even 30 would be preferable to address that. So overall, to sum up everything, a change to circular dead zones, options for separate options, sliders for the tracking and the slowdown. And options for the acceleration curve, a slider ranging from 1.0 to 3.0. And lastly, making the vertical and horizontal sensitivity sliders the same, as well as increasing the cap to 20 or 30. Playing at a very high sensitivity could be difficult, but if you have acceleration curve options, it would, as you can see here, it's very easy to make small adjustments even with large stick movements. So players could easily raise the sensitivity much higher without issue. But that covers it. So hopefully we can see some of these improvements made throughout the game's life. But thanks for watching, and have a good rest of your day.